What if I told you that two cities that saved the world ended up destroying each other? You'll discover how Athens and Sparta, allies who defeated the mighty Persian Empire, became locked in a 27-year death spiral that changed human history forever. One chose democracy and innovation. The other chose discipline and tradition. Both seemed unstoppable, but there was a fatal flaw nobody saw coming. A weakness so devastating it consumed not just these superpowers, but dragged down the entire Greek world. Because what happened isn't just ancient history, it's a warning about power and human nature right now. In the beginning, when the world was young and the gods still walked openly among mortals, Hellas lay fractured like a bronze mirror, shattered by divine hands. Mountains thrust their marble spears toward heaven, dividing the land into countless pockets where men huddled around their hearth fires and called themselves kingdoms. The wine-dark sea carved peninsulas and scattered islands like pearls cast across blue silk, each one a potential fortress, each bay a harbor for dreams of dominion. No great river bound these scattered peoples into one nation. No endless plain invited unity under a single crown. Instead, geography itself decreed that Hellas would birth not one mighty empire, but 1,000 rival cities, each proud as a young god, each certain of its own divine destiny. Here, in this broken landscape, where every valley might hide a rival, and every mountain peak offered refuge to those who would be free, two seeds fell into soil that would nurture them toward entirely different flowering. In the northeast, where Attica's stony hills sloped down to embrace the grey waters of the Aegean, small settlements clustered around a great rock that thrust upward from the plain, like an altar raised to the sky-dwelling immortals. The people called this place Athens, after the grey-eyed goddess who had won it in divine contest, and from the beginning it bore the mark of her wisdom and restless, questing spirit. Far to the south, in the fertile valley of Laconia, where the river Eurotas wound its silver course between mountain walls, another people built their hearths and raised their children under a different star. They named their settlement Sparta, the sown land, and from its earliest days it carried in its bones the memory of conquest and the stern necessity of holding what had been won by iron and blood. The stories their children heard beside evening fires shaped these peoples as surely as the potter's hands shape clay. In the northern city, the contest between Athena and Poseidon lived fresh in every telling. How the grey-eyed goddess struck the rocky hill with her spear and brought forth the first olive tree, its silver-green leaves whispering of peace and plenty. Poseidon's gift had been grander but more terrible, a spring of salt water that spoke of sea roads and distant shores, of trade and adventure, but also of storms and foundering ships. When Cecrops, the earthborn king, who was half man and half serpent, judged between these offerings, he chose wisdom over dominion, the steady light of learning over the wild freedom of the waves. In that choice lay the seed of everything the Attic city would become, a place that would value the word as much as the sword, that would seek to persuade before it sought to compel. The southern people told different tales to their children. They spoke of Heracles, the mighty, greatest of heroes, and how his bloodline flowed in the veins of their kings. They whispered of the oracle at Delphi, where Apollo's priestess breathed sacred vapors and spoke prophecies that shaped the destiny of nations. Most of all, they remembered the coming of the Dorians, those iron-armed warriors who swept down from the north, like wolves descending on the fold. From the beginning, these twin cities grew along different paths. The Attic settlement, perched on her rock like an eagle surveying the world, looked outward to the sea and the possibilities it offered. Her people learned to work gold and silver, to weave fine cloth and throw pottery of surpassing beauty. They welcomed strangers with careful courtesy, traded their oil and wine for amber from the distant north and ivory from beyond the world's edge. Merchants brought more than goods to the northern city. They carried stories of distant lands, of kings who ruled vast empires and wise men who pondered the nature of existence itself. In the agora, where farmers sold their grain and craftsmen displayed their wares, these tales took root and flowered into questions that had no easy answers. What made one man fit to rule another? Could justice be defined by something more than strength? The southern settlement grew differently, shaped by harsher necessities and grimmer choices. The valley that had seemed so fair and fertile to the conquering Dorians came with a price written in blood and iron. For every warrior who could call himself a citizen, 7 of the conquered people bent their backs in the fields, their labor feeding the spears that kept them enslaved. The helots, as these serfs were named, remembered freedom as their grandparents remembered it, and in their eyes burned a hunger that could only be fed by their master's destruction. This knowledge sat heavy on every Laconian heart. They had won the richest valley in the Peloponnese, but they held it only so long as their spears stayed sharp and their resolve never wavered. Unlike the northerners, who could debate and argue and sometimes change their minds, the southern warriors faced a choice that admitted no middle ground: remain strong or face annihilation at the hands of those they had enslaved. The early kings of both cities ruled over communities that bore little resemblance to the mighty powers they would become. The Attic settlement was still a collection of villages scattered across rolling hills, each one jealous of its independence. The southern stronghold, too, began small, though from the first it carried within itself the seeds of something unprecedented in the Greek world. Where other cities were ruled by kings who passed their authority to their sons, the Laconians chose to divide the royal burden between 2 bloodlines, neither supreme over the other. It was in the 8th century, before the birth of Christ, that the southern city faced the test that would forge her character for all time. To the west of Laconia lay another fertile valley, Messenia, where a free people had dwelt since the world's youth. Their land was rich, their warriors brave, their independence jealously guarded by gods and men alike. But Laconian eyes looked upon those green fields and saw the solution to problems that grew more pressing with each harvest. The First Messenian War began as wars often do, with a dispute over cattle and an insult that could not be borne. For 20 years the struggle raged, brother fighting against brother, the children of Heracles seeking to extend their dominion over lands that had never known the Dorian yoke. King Theopompus led the southern armies across the Taygetus mountains, his bronze-tipped spears glinting like stars as they descended into the Messenian plain. Against him stood Euphrates, the brave king of Messenia, who called upon all free Greeks to remember that today's surrender might be tomorrow's enslavement. The war that followed tested both peoples to their limits. Messenian archers sent death singing from the heights of Mount Ithome, while Laconian hoplites locked their shields in formations that moved across the battlefield like iron walls given life. Heroes fell on both sides. Aristodemus, who hurled himself into the thick of battle seeking glorious death, and Aristomenes, whose exploits became the stuff of legend even among his enemies. But numbers and resources told in the end, as they always do when pride and courage are evenly matched. When Mount Ithome finally fell, and the last Messenian stronghold crumbled into ruin, the southern kingdom found herself master of the richest agricultural land in all the Peloponnese. But victory came with a burden that would shape her destiny. more profoundly than any military triumph. The defeated Messenians did not flee or fade away. Instead, they were yoked to the Laconian state as helots, their labor feeding the spears that had conquered them, their resentment burning like coals beneath the ashes of their former freedom. In a single generation, the southern power had doubled her territory and tripled her population of serfs. Where once a few thousand helots had worked Laconian fields under the watchful eyes of their masters, now tens of thousands of the enslaved bent their backs from dawn to dusk, their very numbers making rebellion not just possible, but inevitable. The Second Messenian War came as surely as winter follows autumn, though it took 2 generations for the pot to boil over. The helots who had been born free and enslaved as adults passed their hatred down to their children like a family treasure. Aristomenes rose like a phoenix from the ashes of the old war, a hero king who embodied all the courage and nobility that defeat could not extinguish. For 17 years, the Second War raged, more bitter than the first, because it was fought not for conquest, but for survival itself. The helots controlled the countryside, their numbers swollen by runaway slaves from across the Peloponnese. They had learned warfare from their masters, knew the Laconian way of fighting, could match discipline with desperation. But the southern warriors had learned too, lessons written in blood and carved on their hearts with steel. They discovered that they could not rule an empire through force alone. They needed something more, something that would bind their people together more tightly than shared blood or common language. Under the pressure of constant warfare, Laconian society began its transformation into something unprecedented in human history. The old aristocratic families found their authority checked by new institutions, the Gerousia, a council of elders who spoke for accumulated wisdom, and the Ephors, magistrates chosen by lot who could command even kings. Most importantly, the citizen body itself became a brotherhood of warriors, each man's life subordinated to the needs of the state. The war ended not with a great battle, but with the slow grinding down of Messenian hopes. Aristomenes himself escaped across the sea, his legend intact, but his people broken once more beneath the Laconian yoke. The helots returned to their fields and their servitude, but now they did so under a system of control so thorough that rebellion became almost unthinkable. Every Laconian male would henceforth be a soldier first and everything else second. From the age of 7, boys would be taken from their mothers and raised by the state, learning to endure hardship, to obey without question, to value the good of the community above their own comfort or even their lives. The agoge, they called this system, the rearing, and it would produce warriors whose discipline and courage became bywords throughout the Greek world. Meanwhile, the northern city traveled a different path toward greatness, though no less difficult in its own way. Where the southern kingdom sought to solve her problems through the creation of an armed camp, the Attic settlement faced her challenges through experiment and innovation, trial and error, leading slowly toward discoveries that would reshape human understanding of governance itself. The crisis came not through foreign war, but from within, as the gap between rich and poor grew so wide that the city threatened to tear itself apart. The old families who owned the best land found themselves challenged by new men whose riches came from trade and handicraft. Below both groups seethed masses of poor folk, working smaller and smaller plots of land, many falling into debt that could only be repaid through the enslavement of their own children. Cylon the ambitious had tried to solve these problems through tyranny, seizing the Acropolis with armed followers and proclaiming himself master of the city. But the Athenians, even those who had grievances against the established order, would not trade their freedom for the promise of good government under a dictator. Cylon fell, his supporters scattered, and the northern city found herself face to face with problems that force alone could not resolve. Into this crisis stepped Draco, the lawgiver, whose name would echo through the ages, not for wisdom, but for harshness. The code he established put all the city under the rule of written law for the first time, ending the arbitrary justice of magistrates who interpreted tradition according to their own interests. But Draco's laws, while impartial, were so severe that later generations would say they were written not in ink, but in blood. Death was the penalty for theft, for adultery, for idleness, indeed, for almost every offense that could be imagined. The poor who had hoped for relief from their burdens found themselves subject to punishments that made their former sufferings seem gentle by comparison. The Attic people tottered on the brink of revolution, rich and poor alike, crying out against laws that seemed designed to empty the city of everyone except the dead and the dying. Into this chaos came a man whose wisdom would point the way toward a new understanding of how free people might govern themselves without destroying each other in the process. Solon the lawgiver was a paradox wrapped in flesh, an aristocrat who sympathized with the poor, a poet who thought like a practical politician, a man of wealth who understood that prosperity shared was prosperity preserved. When the Athenians, desperate for any solution that might save their city from civil war, granted him unprecedented authority to reform their constitution, he used that mandate not to enrich himself or his faction, but to seek a middle way between the extremes that threatened to tear the community apart. The reforms he instituted cut to the heart of what had made the city ungovernable. The crushing debts that had reduced free folk to serfs were cancelled with a stroke of the pen. The slaves who had been Athenians before misfortune overtook them were freed and restored to their birthright. The harsh laws of Draco were swept away, replaced by punishments that fit the magnitude of the crimes. But Solon's greatest innovation lay not in what he destroyed, but in what he created. For the first time in human history, a city's government was organized not around birth or riches alone, but around a careful balance of different interests. The wealthy would still have influence proportional to their stake in the community's welfare, but the poor would have voices too. Yet even Solon's wisdom could not solve all problems or satisfy all factions. Into this uncertainty stepped Pisistratus the tyrant, whose very name would become a contradiction, a dictator who preserved democracy, a strongman who ruled through popularity rather than fear. His rule was mild as tyrannies go, focused more on public works and prosperity than on the settling of personal scores. Under his guidance, the northern city began to take on the physical appearance that would make her the wonder of the world. The first great temples rose on the Acropolis, their marble columns catching the light like frozen music. Festivals and public celebrations brought folk together in shared joy, while public works provided employment for the poor and beautification for the rich. But tyranny, however benevolent, carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. When Hippias and Hipparchus inherited their father's authority, they found that ruling free men was more difficult than their father had made it appear. The assassination of Hipparchus by Harmodius and Aristogeiton triggered a reign of terror that reminded all why their ancestors had preferred the chaos of liberty to the peace of tyranny. The end came not through revolution, but through invasion, as the Laconians, themselves hostile to tyranny in all its forms, lent their spears to the cause of Athenian freedom. Hippias fled into exile, his supporters scattered, and the northern city found herself once again face to face with the challenge of self-government. Into this transformed community came Cleisthenes, the democratic, whose reforms would complete the revolution that Solon had begun. Where the earlier lawgiver had sought balance between existing factions, Cleisthenes created entirely new structures that made faction itself irrelevant. The old tribal divisions that had perpetuated aristocratic dominance were swept away, replaced by artificial units that mixed rich and poor, urban and rural. The ecclesia, the assembly of all male inhabitants, became the supreme authority in the state, its decisions binding on magistrates and courts alike. The boule, a council chosen by lot from all the tribes, prepared the business that would come before the assembly. Most revolutionary of all, the practice of ostracism allowed the people to exile any resident who seemed to threaten the democratic order. For the first time in human history, a major city-state was governed entirely by its inhabitants, with no king or tyrant standing above the popular will. Every male resident, regardless of birth or riches, could speak in the assembly, propose laws, hold office if chosen by his fellows. By the close of the 6th century, as the old millennium gave way to the new, both communities had completed their transformation into something unprecedented in human experience. The Southern Kingdom had become a military state so perfectly organized for war that her soldiers would become the measuring stick by which all future warriors would be judged. The northern settlement had created a democracy so complete that every male inhabitant was both ruler and ruled, governor and governed. Neither city yet dominated the Greek world as they would in the century to come. That supremacy would be won through trials that would test their respective systems to the breaking point. The great invasion from the east that would force them to fight as allies. The subsequent conflict that would pit them against each other in a struggle that would reshape the Mediterranean world. But already, in these formative years, the essential characters of both cities had been established. The Attic community would face every challenge through debate and innovation, trusting in the collective wisdom of her inhabitants to find solutions that no individual mind could devise. The Laconian kingdom would meet every crisis with discipline and unity, the absolute loyalty of each resident to the state, creating a strength that no external force could break. 2 seeds had fallen into the soil of Hellas, nurtured by different soils and different seasons. Now they had grown into mighty trees, whose branches would overshadow the ancient world, whose competition would drive both to heights of achievement that neither could have reached alone. The stage was set for the greatest drama in human history, the clash between freedom and order, innovation and tradition, the word and the sword. The world was about to change, and these twin powers would be the instruments of that transformation, whether they willed it or not. Lycurgus haunts every Spartan street, his shadow falling across every decision made in the council chambers of the Southern Kingdom. Whether he was man or myth, god or mortal, no soul can say with certainty. Mists of time have wrapped his deeds in such legend that truth and tale flow together like rivers meeting the sea. Yet his handiwork stands clear as mountain peaks against the sky, carved into the very bones of Sparta, with such precision that no king could alter it, no assembly could vote it away. Some claim he walked among mortals when Troy's towers still kissed the clouds, while others place him in the age when iron first replaced bronze in warriors' hands. The Delphic oracle, speaking through Apollo's priestess in her sacred frenzy, had named him beloved of the gods, neither fully mortal nor divine, but something between, touched by immortal wisdom, yet bound to earthly clay. When he came to Laconia's valley, Sparta festered with civil strife, brother fighting brother, while their helot slaves sharpened hidden blades and whispered of freedom. Ancient aristocracy had grown soft with prosperity. their sons preferring symposiums to spear practice, poetry to the harsh discipline that had won their fathers victories. Meanwhile, common warriors grumbled at the growing gap between themselves and their betters, watching as old equality of the mess halls gave way to private luxury and individual ambition. Beneath both groups, enslaved masses waited like wolves for winter, their numbers growing while their master's unity crumbled like old bronze beneath the hammer. Into this chaos stepped Lycurgus, carrying tablets that would reshape human society more completely than any conqueror's sword. His reforms struck at the root of what had made Sparta ungovernable, the natural human desire for private wealth, individual distinction, personal comfort above communal need. What he created was not merely a new constitution, but an entirely different species of community, one that would sacrifice everything on the altar of collective strength. The great Retra, the fundamental law that Lycurgus carried down from Apollo's shrine, blazed with divine fire when he read it aloud to the assembled citizens. Its words established the framework within which all Spartan life would unfold. The assembly of citizens, the Apella, would meet beneath the open sky, making decisions not through lengthy debate, but through acclamation, roars of approval or silence of dissent revealing the community's will. Above them sat the Gerousia, 28 elders over 60 years of age, chosen for life from among those who had proven their wisdom in war and council. But Lycurgus achieved his masterstroke through creation of the Ephors, 5 magistrates elected annually, by lot from among all qualified citizens. These men could summon kings to account for their actions, could overrule royal commands that threatened the state's welfare, could even arrest and try rulers who forgot that they served the Commonwealth rather than their own ambitions. When kings first bowed before these common-born magistrates, the very foundations of Greek kingship trembled beneath their feet. Gold and silver vanished from Sparta like morning mist before the sun. In their place came iron bars, heated red-hot and quenched in vinegar until they were too brittle for any use except as currency. A wagon load of these ungainly tokens might purchase what a single golden coin could buy elsewhere, making trade with foreign merchants so cumbersome that commerce withered and died. Merchants who came seeking profit departed empty-handed, their foreign luxuries scorned by warriors who had learned to find beauty in bronze and leather alone. Private ownership of land, that source of inequality that had torn apart every previous society, was abolished with surgical precision. The territory of Laconia was divided into 9,000 equal plots, each assigned to a warrior family, each providing exactly what was needed to maintain a household in modest comfort. No man could buy another's portion. No accumulation of wealth could elevate one family above its neighbors. When rich citizens protested this leveling of their estates, Lycurgus reminded them that their true inheritance lay not in soil, but in the spears of their sons. But the transformation that would make Sparta immortal reached deeper than economics or politics. It reshaped the very nature of human development itself. The agoge, the rearing system that would turn boys into warriors and warriors into legends, began its work when children could barely walk. At 7 years of age, every male child was torn from his mother's arms and delivered to communal barracks, where he would learn that the state was his only family, his fellow trainees, his only brothers. Mothers wept as their sons disappeared into the darkness of the training camps, but their tears were forbidden to flow in public. Every household in Sparta echoed with such partings, maternal anguish transformed into patriotic devotion through the iron discipline that governed every aspect of their lives. Boys who entered the agoge left behind not just their families, but their very identities as individuals, becoming instead instruments of the state's will. Boys were divided into companies under command of young men barely out of their teens, themselves still learning harsh lessons that would make them leaders of men. Deliberately underfed, clothed in simple tunics that served for both summer heat and winter cold, trained to steal successfully rather than depend on charity. These children learned that comfort was weakness, that individual desire must bow before collective need, that death in service to the community was the highest honor any mortal could achieve. Pain became their teacher, hardship their companion, obedience their religion. They slept on beds of reeds they gathered themselves from the river's edge, their feet unshod, even when frost made ground ring like bronze. When they spoke, it was with economy of words that would make laconic a byword for brevity. Every syllable weighed, every phrase measured, unnecessary speech treated as a form of weakness. Boys who wasted words on complaint soon found themselves hungry for days, learning that silence often spoke louder than eloquence. The crypteia, that most terrible of Spartan institutions, completed their education in the final year before full citizenship. Chosen from among the most promising youths, these young men were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and their wits, charged with hunting down any helot who showed signs of independence or intelligence. For a full year, they lived like wolves, sleeping by day in hidden caves, moving by night through territories they knew as well as their own heartbeats. Young warriors crouched in olive groves and mountain passes, watching for helots who spoke too boldly of the old days when their people were free. When darkness fell and the workers returned to their hovels, death came silently to those who dared remember their ancestors' independence. No mere military exercise was this, but a form of terrorism so systematic that it broke the spirit of resistance before it could take root. Helots who worked the fields learned that any sign of leadership, any flash of defiance, any whisper of rebellion, would bring death in the darkness. Young warriors learned that mercy was a luxury their state could not afford, that preservation of their way of life required constant vigilance and occasional cruelty. When they returned from their year in the wild, their eyes held the cold light of predators who had learned to kill without hatred, to destroy without passion. Yet for all its harshness, this system created something unprecedented in human experience, a warrior class whose loyalty to each other and to their common cause was absolute. When a Spartan warrior stood in the battle line, he knew with perfect certainty that men beside him would never retreat, never abandon him, never choose individual survival over collective honor. His shield bore the inscription that summarized their entire philosophy: return with this or upon it. Women of Sparta underwent their own transformation, though along different lines than their menfolk. Unlike their sisters in other Greek cities, who spent their lives confined to women's quarters and domestic duties, Spartan maidens trained their bodies as rigorously as their brothers trained theirs. They ran races, wrestled, threw javelins, their bronzed limbs gleaming with oil as they competed in festivals where modesty yielded to physical excellence. These customs served no mere indulgence in barbarian ways, but followed carefully calculated policy, designed to produce mothers worthy of warrior sons. Strong women bore healthy children, and healthy children grew into effective soldiers. When visitors from other cities gasped at the sight of female flesh, displayed without shame, Spartan women replied that they served their state's needs rather than foreign notions of propriety. Marriage customs that governed their unions reflected this same ruthless focus on the state's needs above individual desires. Young men in their 20s were paired with maidens in their teens, not through romantic courtship, but through practical arrangements designed to produce the finest possible offspring. Husbands visited their brides in darkness and left before dawn, their relationship remaining formal and distant until children proved their union's worth to the community. Property descended through the female line in Sparta, a revolutionary departure from Greek custom that had profound implications for the balance of social forces. Women controlled nearly 40% of Spartan land, making them partners rather than dependents in the great work of maintaining their society's strength. When their husbands died in battle, as many did, they did not become burdens upon their families, but rather guardians of estates that could support new generations of warriors. Apollo's priests chanted hymns that wove divine blessing through every aspect of this social order. In his great temple, where the lawgiver's bones were said to rest, golden tripods held sacred fires that burned continuously, their smoke carrying prayers for the community's strength to the ears of the immortals. The god of order and harmony received special honor as the patron who had inspired Lycurgus's wisdom, his festivals celebrating not individual achievement but collective discipline. Young warriors marched in procession through Apollo's sacred grove, their bronze armor catching sunlight like mirrors reflecting divine glory. They sang paeans that their grandfathers had sung, words that celebrated not personal heroism, but the unity that made heroism possible. Their voices rang across the valley in ancient hymns that bound past to present, making each generation guardians of traditions that must never die. Artemis, the virgin huntress, served as patroness to maidens who would become mothers of warriors. Her cult emphasized the same values that governed the Agoge: endurance of hardship, skill in the chase, loyalty to one's pack above all other considerations. When young women ran naked in her honor, their bodies painted with sacred symbols, they proclaimed their readiness to serve the community's needs rather than their own desires. Even burial customs of Sparta reflected their unique values, though death in battle was celebrated while ordinary passing was forgotten. Only warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth received marked graves and memorial inscriptions. All others passed into anonymity, their individual lives swallowed up in the greater glory of the state they had served. Death in service became the only path to immortality, the only way to achieve honor that made life worth living. Meanwhile, in Athens, a very different experiment in human governance was taking shape through innovations that would prove no less revolutionary than the Spartan transformation. Where Sparta sought to create perfect unity through elimination of individual will, Athens discovered that diversity of opinion, properly channeled, could generate wisdom greater than any single mind could achieve. The crisis that had brought Solon to prominence still festered like an unhealed wound. His constitution, for all its wisdom, remained a delicate balance of competing interests that required constant adjustment to prevent collapse. Poor citizens still hungered for land redistribution that would give them economic independence, while the wealthy feared any further erosion of their traditional privileges. Between these extremes, the growing class of merchants and artisans sought political influence proportional to their economic importance. Pisistratus had provided temporary stability through the oldest of solutions: personal rule backed by armed force. His bodyguards paraded through the agora with clubs of olive wood, their presence a gentle reminder that opposition to their master's will would meet with swift correction. But his tyranny, however benevolent, carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. When a ruler governs through personal popularity rather than institutional authority, his power dies with him unless his successors can match his skill at managing competing factions. Hippias and Hipparchus inherited their father's position, but not his talent for reading the popular mood. Where Pisistratus had been a fox who ruled through cunning, his sons were wolves who relied increasingly on fear. Taxes rose to fund their building projects, while critics found themselves exiled or worse. The brothers trusted no one completely, surrounding themselves with mercenaries who spoke foreign tongues and cared nothing for Athenian tradition. The assassination of Hipparchus by Harmodius and Aristogeiton transformed a personal grievance into a political crisis that would reshape the entire Athenian understanding of governance. The two lovers had acted not from public spirit, but from private outrage. Hipparchus had insulted Harmodius's sister, excluding her from the sacred procession that honored Athena, claiming she was unworthy to carry the goddess's sacred implements. At the Panathenaic festival, when all Athens gathered to honor their patron deity, the conspirators struck. Harmodius fell immediately, his blood staining the sacred way, while Aristogeiton fought his way through the crowd before being overwhelmed by the tyrant's guards. Their deaths became legend, even as their bodies cooled. Two young men who had preferred death to dishonor, who had chosen to act rather than endure insult in silence. Hippias survived his brother's murder, but not the fear that followed it. The reign of terror that ensued convinced every thinking Athenian that tyranny, however mild its beginnings, inevitably degenerated into arbitrary exercise of personal will. Citizens whispered accusations against their neighbors, while the tyrant's spies listened at every symposium for words that might hint at disloyalty. When Hippias finally fled into exile, chased by Spartan spears and Athenian hatred, the city found herself facing the same fundamental question that had troubled every Greek community since time immemorial. Into this uncertainty stepped Cleisthenes, scion of the ancient Alcmaeonid family, whose reforms would complete the democratic revolution that Solon had begun. But where the earlier lawgiver had sought compromise between existing factions, Cleisthenes proposed something far more radical: complete restructuring of Athenian society to make faction itself irrelevant. The tribal system that had governed Athens since the Age of Heroes was swept away with surgical precision. 4 ancient tribes, each dominated by aristocratic families whose bloodlines reached back to legendary kings, were replaced by 10 new artificial units that mixed urban and rural populations, rich and poor, native-born and immigrant families. Aristocrats who had ruled through geographical concentration of supporters suddenly found their influence scattered across the countryside like seeds on barren ground. Each of these new tribes was itself divided into smaller units called demes, rural villages and urban neighborhoods that became the basic building blocks of democratic participation. Every male citizen was registered in the dem where he lived, regardless of his family's traditional affiliations. These local communities became schools of democracy, where ordinary farmers and craftsmen learned the arts of debate and decision-making that had once been the exclusive preserve of the well-born. The ecclesia, the assembly of all citizens, became the supreme authority in the state, its decisions binding upon magistrates and courts alike. Every male citizen over 18 years of age could attend its meetings, speak to any proposal, cast his vote on matters ranging from declarations of war to the funding of public festivals. Farmers left their plows, potters abandoned their wheels, merchants closed their shops to climb the hill where democracy was born anew each meeting day. But Cleisthenes understood that mere participation was not enough. The assembly needed guidance from those who had the time and expertise to study complex issues in detail. The Boule, a council of 500 members chosen by lot from the tribes, prepared the agenda for each assembly meeting and ensured that every proposal received proper consideration before coming to a vote. Selection of council members by lot rather than election, was perhaps the most radical aspect of the entire system. Where other communities trusted in the wisdom of their most prominent citizens, Athenian democracy proclaimed that any free man possessed sufficient judgment to participate in governance. Random selection process ensured that wealth and family connections could not dominate the council, while rotation of membership meant that thousands of ordinary folk would gain experience in the practical arts of administration. Ordinary citizens found themselves chosen by lot to serve on the boule, their names drawn from bronze urns, along with their fellow tribesmen. Farmers who had never spoken before, more than a handful of neighbors, suddenly faced the responsibility of preparing legislation for an assembly of thousands. Yet when they rose to address their fellow councillors about matters they knew from daily experience, their words carried the authority of men who understood the real consequences of the laws they helped to craft. The practice of ostracism provided the final safeguard against the return of tyranny or the dominance of any single personality. Once each year, the assembly could vote to exile any citizen for 10 years without trial or explanation. Citizens who received the most votes, provided at least 6,000 participated in the process, would leave the community within 10 days, their property protected, but their person banished until the specified time had passed. Ostraca, the pottery shards on which citizens scratched the names of those they wished to exile, littered the agora like autumn leaves after each voting. Some bore the names of prominent politicians, others carried accusations against figures who had somehow aroused popular suspicion. The randomness of it all served democracy's purpose. No man, however powerful, could feel secure in his position if the people turned against him. Such institution served multiple purposes, beyond its obvious function as a check on dangerous ambition. It provided a safety valve for popular frustration, allowing the community to remove troublesome figures without the bloodshed that usually accompanied such purges. More subtly, it reminded every politician that his influence depended ultimately upon popular goodwill rather than inherited position or accumulated wealth. Judicial system that emerged from these reforms reflected the same democratic principles that governed the political structure. Juries were chosen by lot from among all qualified citizens, with panels ranging from 200 to over 1,000 members, depending upon the importance of the case. These ordinary folk, farmers and potters, merchants and scribes, became the ultimate arbiters of justice, their collective wisdom trusted above the individual judgment of professional magistrates. Transformation of Athens was no less complete than the Spartan Revolution, though it moved in precisely the opposite direction. Where Sparta had achieved unity through elimination of individual will, Athens discovered strength through orchestration of diverse voices into a harmonious whole. Where the Spartan system demanded absolute obedience to unchanging law, Athenian democracy celebrated the capacity for growth and adaptation that came from constant debate and discussion. Yet both experiments in human governance faced similar challenges in their daily operation. The Spartan system, for all its elegance, required a level of self-discipline that pushed human nature to its breaking point. Men who had been raised from childhood to subordinate personal desire to communal need still felt the stirrings of ambition, the hunger for individual recognition, the simple wish to live for themselves rather than the state. Athenian democracy struggled with different but equally fundamental problems. How could a community make rational decisions when every citizen, regardless of his knowledge or experience, possessed an equal voice in determining policy? How could long-term planning proceed when popular assemblies might reverse previous decisions based on momentary passion or the persuasive power of clever speakers? Both systems would face their ultimate test in the trials that lay ahead. the great invasion from the east that would force them to fight as allies, the subsequent struggle that would pit their competing visions of human society against each other in a conflict that would reshape the ancient world. But already, in these formative years, the essential characters of both communities had been established. Sparta had created a society of warriors whose loyalty to each other and to their common cause was absolute, whose discipline and courage would become the measuring stick by which all future soldiers would be judged. Athens had discovered that free men, properly organized, could govern themselves without destroying each other, that the wisdom of the many could surpass the judgment of the few. Two different answers to the eternal questions of human governance now stood ready to test themselves against the challenges that fate would bring. The stage was set for a drama that would determine whether the future belonged to those who trusted in unity and discipline, or those who believed in diversity and debate, whether human societies would be shaped by the iron fist of collective will or the gentle art of democratic persuasion. Fire consumed the temples of Sardis, their marble columns cracking like bones in the heat, while smoke darkened the sky above the greatest city of Lydia. Athenian marines had helped kindle those flames in support of the Ionian revolt, their bronze spears glinting as they fought beside Greeks who had grown weary of Persian rule. But as the rebels celebrated their brief victory, messengers were already racing eastward along the royal road, carrying word of this insult to the great king himself. Darius, king of kings, ruler of 23 nations, master of territories that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, heard the report while seated on his golden throne in Persepolis, his dark eyes fixed upon the messenger who had brought news of Greek impudence, his voice like distant thunder when he spoke. "Who are these Athenians?" The question echoed through halls where the tribute of the world was displayed, where kings prostrated themselves before divine majesty incarnate. When his advisors explained that Athens was but one among many small Greek cities scattered across the western edge of his empire, the great king's response became legend. He commanded that a servant remind him thrice daily, "Master, remember the Athenians." Each repetition of those words was a promise, an oath sworn before Ahura Mazda himself that this insult would not pass unanswered. The Ionian revolt flickered like a flame in wind before the organized might of the Persian Empire. City after city fell to the great king's generals, their walls breached by siege engines, their harbors blocked by Phoenician ships. Miletus, greatest of the Ionian cities, held out longest against the siege, her citizens fighting with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant slavery or death. When her walls finally crumbled beneath Persian assault, the survivors were marched eastward into exile, their homeland given over to barbarian settlers. At Athens, the news of Miletus's fall struck the populace like a physical blow. In the theatre of Dionysus, when the poet Phrynichus presented his tragedy, The Sack of Miletus, the entire audience wept openly for their kinsman's fate. But tears alone could not undo what had been done, and wise men understood that the fall of Ionia was merely the prelude to a greater symphony of conquest. Darius turned his attention westward with the patience of a god who counts mortal years as moments. The first expedition, entrusted to his son-in-law Mardonius, met disaster when storms shattered his fleet against the rocky promontory of Mount Athos. Ships by the hundreds vanished beneath the wine-dark waves, while Thracian tribesmen fell upon the survivors with bronze-headed spears and axes of northern steel. Yet the great king's resources were as boundless as his determination, and one setback could not deflect his purpose. 2 years later, a second expedition assembled on the plains of Cilicia. Darius had chosen new commanders for this venture: Artaphernes, his nephew, and Datis the Mede, veterans whose loyalty had been proven in a dozen campaigns. Their fleet numbered 600 ships, their army perhaps 25,000 strong, not vast by Persian standards, but sufficient to deal with scattered Greek resistance. Across the Aegean they sailed, pausing only to demonstrate Persian might to any who might consider defiance. Naxos fell without resistance, her population enslaved, her temples stripped of their treasures. Eretria on Euboea endured a brief siege before her walls were breached, her people suffering the same fate as the Milesians, exiled to the far reaches of the empire, their homeland repopulated by Persian settlers. Then came the moment all Greece had dreaded. Persian ships beached in the Bay of Marathon, their bronze-armored marines wading ashore, while cavalry disembarked from specially constructed transports. The plain that stretched inland from the beach seemed ideal for the kind of warfare at which Persian arms excelled. Open ground where horse archers could maneuver freely, where disciplined infantry could deploy in the formations that had conquered half the world. At Athens, the debate raged with intensity that matched the crisis. Some voices counseled submission. Better to bend the knee now than see their city suffer Miletus's fate. Others spoke of honor and freedom, of the duty owed to the gods who had blessed their democracy. In the end, it was Miltiades who swayed the assembly, the veteran general whose knowledge of Persian ways had been earned through years of service under their banners. The great king offers us slavery dressed as peace, he declared, his scarred hands gesturing toward the east where enemy fires twinkled along the coast. But free men who yield their liberty for safety shall have neither safety nor liberty. Better to die with bronze in our hands than live with chains upon our wrists. The Athenian army that marched out to Marathon numbered barely 11,000 strong, every hoplite the city could muster, stiffened by perhaps 1,000 Plataeans who had answered their allies' call for aid. Against them stood the veterans of Darius, men who had campaigned from Egypt to Scythia, whose bronze scales gleamed with the authority of the world's greatest empire. Yet as the two armies faced each other across the plain, something extraordinary began to unfold. Miltiades had studied Persian tactics during his years in the Chersonese, understood how their archers softened enemy formations before the infantry closed for the kill. His solution was audacious in its simplicity. Stretch the Athenian line to match the Persian front, then charge before their arrows could take proper toll. The battle cry that arose from Greek throats echoed off the mountains like thunder from Zeus himself. "Athena! Athens! Freedom!" 10,000 voices roared as bronze-shod feet pounded across the plain, spear points gleaming like stars fallen to earth. The Persian center, strongest part of their line, held firm against the assault, their shields locked tight, their spears taking heavy toll of Greek flesh. But on the wings, where Miltiades had placed his weakest troops against the Persian flanks, desperate courage achieved what numbers could not. Athenian farmers and potters, men who had learned war only in recent years, broke through lines held by professional soldiers. The Persian formation began to buckle like bronze under too much heat, discipline giving way to confusion as the carefully planned battle dissolved into chaos. When the Athenian wings turned inward to strike the Persian center from behind, the day was won. Veterans of 20 campaigns broke and fled toward their ships, trampling their own comrades in their haste to escape the bronze points that pursued them. Some reached the transports and were pulled aboard by desperate sailors. while others drowned in the shallows as they cast away armor and weapons in their flight. Marathon became legend even as the battle raged, but its truest monument was not bronze or marble, but flesh and blood. Eucles, a professional runner in his youth, carried word of victory back to Athens, his feet flying over the mountain paths that separated the battlefield from the city. "Rejoice, we are victorious," he gasped as he collapsed in the agora, his heart bursting from the effort, his life spent to bring joy to his fellow citizens. The victory sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world. If Athens could defeat the might of Persia, perhaps the barbarians were not invincible after all. But thoughtful men understood that Marathon was only the beginning, that Darius would return with forces that would make this first expedition seem like a scouting party. At Sparta, news of the Athenian triumph arrived with the army that had set out to aid their northern neighbors. The Spartans had marched north with characteristic discipline, covering the distance from Laconia to Attica in just 3 days. But religious scruples had delayed their departure. The sacred calendar forbade military expeditions during certain phases of the moon, and not even the threat to Greek freedom could make them violate divine law. They arrived to find Persian corpses dotting the battlefield, their bronze armor being stripped by scavengers, their bodies already beginning to swell in the autumn heat. King Leonidas himself walked among the dead, studying Persian equipment and tactics with the eye of a professional soldier. "They die like other men," he observed to his companions, but his tone carried no mockery, only the grim satisfaction of one who understood that this enemy, however numerous, was not superhuman. The decade that followed Marathon was a time of feverish preparation throughout the Greek world. Darius had died while planning his revenge, but his son Xerxes inherited both throne and obsession. The new great king's resources dwarfed even his father's ambitions. Armies were summoned from every corner of the empire, fleets assembled from Egypt to Phoenicia, while engineers cut a canal through the peninsula of Mount Athos to spare future expeditions the fate that had befallen Mardonius. At Athens, Themistocles emerged as the champion of naval expansion, his silver tongue convincing the assembly to spend the windfall from new silver discoveries on ships rather than distribution to individual citizens. "Wood walls will save us," he declared, quoting the enigmatic prophecy delivered by the Delphic oracle, "not stone ones that can be breached by Persian siege engines." The program he championed was revolutionary in its scope. Athens had possessed perhaps 70 warships before Marathon. Now her shipyards rang with the sound of hammers as 200 triremes took shape beneath skilled hands. Each vessel required a crew of 170 men, training thousands of citizens in the arts of naval warfare. What had been a land power with modest maritime interests was transforming itself into a naval force that could challenge Persian supremacy at sea. Meanwhile, Sparta faced her own debates about the coming storm. Some argued that the southern kingdom should trust in her mountain barriers and allow the barbarians to exhaust themselves against more exposed targets. Others, led by Leonidas himself, insisted that Greek freedom was indivisible. If Athens fell, Sparta would face the next assault alone, with Persian bases established throughout central Greece. When Xerxes finally moved west, his forces beggar description. Herodotus, who made it his life's work to record the deeds of that generation, estimated the Persian army at over 1 million men, though more sober calculations suggest perhaps 200,000 fighting troops, supported by an equal number of servants and camp followers. Whatever the true count, this was the largest military force ever assembled in human history, a migration of nations united under one man's will. The march to Greece became an epic in itself. Persian engineers bridged the Hellespont with cables of flax and papyrus. Their ships lashed together to form a roadway wide enough for chariots to pass each other. When storms destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes ordered the sea itself to be whipped for its insubordination. 300 lashes to teach the waters proper respect for royal authority. As this vast host poured into Europe, Greek resistance crystallized around an unlikely alliance. Athens and Sparta, so different in their values and institutions, found common cause in the face of extinction. Other cities sent representatives to the Congress at the Isthmus of Corinth, where strategies were debated and commands assigned. Some polis chose collaboration with the invader, calculating that Persian rule might prove less oppressive than destruction. But enough remained loyal to the cause of Greek freedom to mount credible resistance. The first test came at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where the road south could be blocked by a relatively small force. Leonidas led 7,000 Greeks to that position, including his personal guard of 300 Spartans, men selected not only for their courage, but for their sons, ensuring that their bloodlines would continue even if they themselves fell in battle. For 3 days, the pass held against every assault Xerxes could mount. Persian arrows darkened the sky like clouds of locusts, but Greek bronze turned aside most shafts, while the narrow front prevented the invaders from bringing their numerical superiority to bear. When his elite immortals charged the Greek line, they met spear points wielded by men who had trained for such moments since childhood. But geography ultimately proved stronger than heroism. A local shepherd, seeking Persian gold, showed Xerxes' troops a mountain path that bypassed the main position. When dawn broke on the third day, Leonidas found himself surrounded, his small force facing destruction from front and rear simultaneously. The Spartan king made his choice with the clarity that his upbringing had instilled. He sent away the other Greek contingents, keeping only his own 300 and a handful of Thespians, who refused to abandon their Spartan allies. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger, passing by," reads the epitaph later carved over their burial mound, "that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The slaughter that followed became legend. Persian arrows finally found their marks when the Greeks ran out of spears and were forced to fight with swords and bare hands. Leonidas himself fell defending his men's bodies, his corpse fought over like a prize until Persian numbers finally overwhelmed the last defenders. Xerxes, in a gesture of respect and rage, ordered the Spartan king's head cut off and mounted on a spear, an honor he had never before granted to a fallen enemy. Yet even in death, Thermopylae served its purpose. The 3-day delay had given Athens time to evacuate her civilian population to Salamis and the Peloponnese, while the heroic sacrifice inspired Greek resistance throughout the peninsula. When news of the battle spread, men who might have submitted to Persian demands instead chose to fight, remembering that 300 Spartans had shown that the invaders could be resisted. The Persian host rolled south through central Greece like a bronze avalanche, meeting little organized resistance. Athens herself was abandoned to the flames, her temples pulled down, her sacred olive tree on the Acropolis hacked apart by barbarian axes. But the Athenian fleet remained intact, hidden among the islands where Persian numbers counted for nothing and Greek seamanship could prove decisive. At Salamis, in the narrow strait between the island and the mainland, Themistocles achieved his masterstroke. Using every trick of diplomacy and psychology at his command, he lured the Persian fleet into waters where their numbers became a liability rather than an asset. Ships collided with their own allies in the confined space, while Greek triremes, more maneuverable than their heavier opponents, rammed and sank vessel after vessel. Xerxes watched his navy's destruction from a golden throne set upon the shore, his rage growing with each ship that slipped beneath the wine-dark waves. When the battle ended, Persian naval supremacy lay broken on the rocks of Salamis. The massive fleet that had transported his army reduced to wreckage scattered across the bay. With winter approaching and his supply lines threatened by Greek naval resurgence, the great king made the only decision available to him. Taking the bulk of his forces back to Asia, he left behind a picked army under Mardonius to complete the conquest when spring returned. But the psychological advantage had shifted decisively. The Greeks had seen that Persian might could be broken, that courage and skill could triumph over mere numbers. The following summer brought the final test at Plataea, where Spartan discipline and Athenian determination combined to shatter the last Persian army on European soil. Mardonius himself fell in the fighting, his golden armor stripped from his corpse by Greek hands, his dreams of conquest buried beneath the soil of Boeotia. As Persian survivors limped back across the Hellespont, two cities that had seemed destined for slavery instead found themselves masters of their own destiny. Athens and Sparta had proven that free men fighting for their homes could defeat even the mightiest empire, that courage guided by wisdom was stronger than tyranny, backed by overwhelming force. Yet even in the moment of triumph, seeds of future conflict were already taking root. The victory had been won by alliance, but maintaining that alliance in peacetime would prove far more difficult than achieving it in war. Two very different visions of Greek freedom, one emphasizing individual liberty, the other collective discipline, had united against a common enemy. With that enemy defeated, the question remained whether they could coexist in a world where only Greeks held the balance of power. Victory over Xerxes had left the Greek world transformed, like bronze reforged in the smith's fire. Where once scattered city-states had cowered before Persian might, now they stood as equals among the nations of the earth, their spears having proven that free men could triumph over the mightiest empire. Yet even as they celebrated their deliverance, the very success of their alliance began to reveal the fault lines that would eventually tear Hellas apart. The immediate question facing the victorious Greeks was whether to pursue their advantage across the Aegean or rest content with driving the barbarians from European soil. Many islands and coastal cities still groaned beneath Persian rule, their Greek populations crying out for liberation. But the campaign required by such an undertaking would demand resources far beyond what any single polis could provide. Coordination of naval forces on a scale never before attempted in the Greek world. Sparta, her immediate territory secured behind mountain barriers, showed little enthusiasm for distant expeditions. King Leotychidas, who had commanded Greek forces at the victory of Mycale, argued that the southern kingdom lacked both the ships and the inclination for overseas adventures. "Let those who live by the sea fight on the sea," he declared in the Council of Allies, "while those who guard the land continue their ancient watch." Such reluctance reflected deeper currents in Spartan thinking than mere military convenience. Campaigns beyond the Peloponnese required citizen soldiers to remain away from home for extended periods, leaving their helot populations unsupervised. Already there were whispers of unrest among the enslaved masses, rumors that Persian gold was finding its way to malcontents who dreamed of throwing off their chains while their masters campaigned abroad. Into this vacuum of leadership stepped Athens, her confidence swollen by the victories at Marathon and Salamis. Aristides the Just, whose reputation for incorruptible honesty had made him trusted throughout the Greek world, proposed the formation of a new alliance dedicated to driving Persian influence from the Aegean permanently. Unlike the temporary coalition that had faced Xerxes, this league would have permanent institutions, regular contributions, and unified command. The meeting convened on the sacred island of Delos, where Apollo's temple provided neutral ground for negotiations between sovereign cities. Representatives from nearly 200 communities gathered in the shadow of the god's altar, their voices echoing across the harbor as they debated the terms of their association. The Delian League, as posterity would name it, emerged from these discussions as something unprecedented in Greek experience, a voluntary confederation of equals united by common purpose. Each member city would contribute either ships or money to the common cause, with Athens providing the largest contingent and serving as the league's executive authority. The treasury would rest in Apollo's temple on Delos, protected by divine sanction and distributed according to the assembly's collective will. Annual tribute assessments, calculated by Aristides himself, would ensure that every member bore a fair share of the burden, while none was overwhelmed by obligations beyond their means. Aristides walked through every contributing community during that first year, his stylus scratching across wax tablets as he calculated each polis's capacity to contribute. In Naxos, he examined the island's marble quarries and wheat fields. At Thasos, he toured the gold mines that would fund the League's earliest expeditions. His assessments became legend for their fairness. Not once did any city complain that their burden exceeded their neighbors, a feat of diplomatic skill that earned him immortal renown. The League's first campaigns met with spectacular success. Persian garrisons evacuated island after island rather than face Greek assault, while those who chose to resist found themselves overwhelmed by coordinated attacks from sea and land. Cimon, son of Miltiades, emerged as the League's premier naval commander, his tactical genius complementing Athenian seamanship to create a fighting force unmatched in Mediterranean waters. At the Eurymedon River, where the Persian fleet had sought refuge behind river bars and coastal fortifications, Cimon achieved a double victory that shattered enemy morale throughout Asia Minor. His triremes forced the river mouth while marine contingents stormed the beach, capturing or destroying 200 Persian vessels in a single day. When enemy reinforcements arrived overland, the same Greek forces that had won the naval battle turned to meet them, routing an army that outnumbered them 3-1. Such triumphs sent waves of euphoria throughout the League's membership. Persian strength, which had seemed so overwhelming during Xerxes' invasion, crumbled before determined Greek assault. City after city threw off barbarian rule, their populations greeting League forces as liberators rather than conquerors. The treasury on Delos swelled with captured loot and grateful contributions, while Athenian prestige reached heights undreamed of by their ancestors. Yet success carried its own dangers, as wise men had always understood. The League that had begun as an association of equals gradually transformed into something more resembling an empire, with Athens at its head and her former allies increasingly reduced to the status of subject cities. The transformation proceeded so gradually that few noticed its early stages, like a tide that rises imperceptibly until suddenly familiar landmarks disappear beneath the waves. The first sign of change came when several island communities requested permission to commute their ship contributions for monetary payments instead. Maintaining triremes required not only initial construction costs, but ongoing expenses for crews, supplies, and maintenance that strained smaller cities' resources. Athens readily agreed to these arrangements, using the additional funds to expand her own fleet, while her allies' naval capabilities atrophied through disuse. What seemed like practical efficiency contained the seeds of political dependence. Cities that no longer maintained warships could not easily withdraw from the League, even if they wished to, lacking the naval strength to defend themselves against Athenian retaliation. When Naxos attempted to secede after a dispute over tribute assessments, her rebellion was crushed so swiftly that other members took note. The League had become something from which departure was no longer possible. The transfer of the treasury from Delos to Athens marked another milestone in this evolution. Officially, the move was justified by security concerns. Athenian walls could protect the League's wealth better than Apollo's island sanctuary. But thoughtful observers recognized the symbolism involved when sacred funds dedicated to common purposes came under the exclusive control of a single city's magistrates. Pericles, who had emerged as Athens's dominant political figure, made no attempt to disguise the imperial nature of the relationship. "We rule the sea," he declared in the Ecclesia, his words carrying across the assembly like the crash of waves against stone. Those who share in that rule's benefits must accept its obligations. Justice lies not in weakness disguised as equality, but in strength exercised with wisdom. Under his guidance, Athens embarked upon a building program that announced her supremacy to the world. The Parthenon rose upon the Acropolis like a mountain of marble and gold, its columns perfectly proportioned, its sculptures representing the pinnacle of artistic achievement. But the temple's magnificence carried a political message as clear as any military victory. This was the treasure house of an imperial power, built with tribute extracted from subject allies. Sparta watched these developments with growing unease, though her response remained characteristically measured. The Laconian kingdom had never sought to challenge Athenian maritime dominance, content to maintain her traditional supremacy on land while leaving naval affairs to others. But the expansion of Athenian influence raised questions that could not be ignored indefinitely. What would happen when imperial ambitions began to threaten Spartan interests directly? The Peloponnesian League, Sparta's own alliance system, operated on principles fundamentally different from the Athenian model. Rather than extracting tribute or demanding ship contributions, the southern kingdom relied upon traditional bonds of mutual defense and shared interest. Member cities retained full autonomy in domestic affairs, while accepting Spartan leadership in military matters, an arrangement that reflected the land-based nature of their confederation. Corinth, greatest of Sparta's allies, found herself increasingly caught between these competing systems. Her commercial interests demanded access to markets throughout the Greek world, many of which now lay under Athenian control. Yet her strategic position at the crossroads between central Greece and the Peloponnese made her essential to Spartan security calculations. The tensions inherent in this dual loyalty would eventually provide the spark for larger conflagrations. Trade disputes that might once have been settled through negotiation or arbitration now carried political overtones that threatened to escalate into military confrontation. When Athens banned Megarian merchants from her markets throughout the empire, ostensibly in retaliation for border violations, the economic warfare struck at the heart of interstate commerce. Megara, allied to Sparta through the Peloponnesian League, had little choice but to appeal to her protector for redress. Similar pressure tactics spread throughout the Aegean as Athens consolidated her control over maritime trade routes. Cities that had once dealt with multiple partners found themselves forced to choose between Athenian favor and economic isolation. The soft empire of commercial dependence proved as effective as military conquest in ensuring compliance with imperial policy, while creating fewer opportunities for open resistance. Pericles defended these policies with arguments that resonated powerfully among Athenian citizens. Democracy requires resources, he reminded the assembly. and resources require power to protect them. Those who benefit from our naval supremacy should contribute to its maintenance. Those who threaten it should face its consequences. The logic was unassailable within its own terms, yet it created a spiral of suspicion and resentment that poisoned relations between former allies. Cities that had once fought side by side against Persian tyranny now eyed each other with the wariness of potential enemies, each calculating whether submission or resistance offered better prospects for survival. Religious festivals and athletic competitions, those ancient bonds that had united the Greek world in peaceful rivalry, became venues for diplomatic maneuvering and veiled threats. At the Olympic Games, where sacred truce traditionally protected all participants, tensions ran so high that armed guards accompanied rival delegations. The Pythian Games at Delphi witnessed similar scenes as Athenian and Spartan influence networks competed for the favor of wavering neutrals. Meanwhile, cultural achievements reached heights that would remain unsurpassed for generations. The wealth that flowed into Athens from her maritime empire funded not only military expeditions and public buildings, but also the theatrical festivals that gave birth to tragedy and comedy as literary forms. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides crafted dramas that explored the deepest questions of human existence, while audiences gathered in the theatre of Dionysus witnessed the premiere of works that would outlive the civilization that created them. Philosophy, too, flourished in the intellectual ferment of imperial Athens. Anaxagoras brought natural philosophy from Ionia, teaching that the sun was not a god, but a mass of white-hot stone larger than the Peloponnese. Protagoras arrived from Abdera with his doctrine that man is the measure of all things, challenging traditional assumptions about divine law and human knowledge. The city buzzed with debates that ranged from the nature of justice to the composition of matter, discussions that laid the foundations for all subsequent Western thought. Yet these intellectual achievements rested upon political foundations that grew increasingly unstable with each passing year. The very success of Athenian democracy in creating wealth and power generated forces that would ultimately tear the Greek world apart. Imperial tribute funded the festivals and philosophical schools, but it also bred resentment among those who paid the bills. Naval supremacy protected Athenian commerce, but it threatened the independence that other cities valued above material prosperity. Sparta, meanwhile, remained largely untouched by these intellectual currents, her citizens content with the ancestral wisdom that had served them well for centuries. Where Athens celebrated innovation and debate, the Laconian kingdom prized tradition and consensus. Where Athenian orators proclaimed the virtues of empire, Spartan kings spoke quietly of honor and the obligations that bound allies together as equals rather than masters and subjects. The contrast between these competing visions of Greek civilization grew sharper with each diplomatic crisis. When Athens demanded that Potidæa tear down her walls and surrender hostages as guarantees of loyalty, the city's appeal to Corinth for support was answered with promises that struck at the heart of the imperial system. Free cities, declared the Corinthian ambassador, should not bow to threats from those who claim to protect them. Such language carried implications that neither side could ignore indefinitely. The Cold War between democratic empire and aristocratic alliance had reached the point where compromise seemed increasingly impossible, where each side's fundamental principles ruled out accommodation with the other. The question was no longer whether conflict would come, but when and how it would begin. As the summer of 431 drew toward its close, minor incidents along the borders of influence multiplied like sparks in dry timber. A dispute between Corcyra and Corinth over colonial rights escalated into naval warfare, drawing in their respective allies and demonstrating how local conflicts could metastasize into broader confrontations. The carefully constructed peace that had followed the Persian Wars was unraveling thread by thread, victim of its own success. Two leagues now divided the Greek world between them, each representing a different answer to the fundamental questions of political organization. Would the future belong to empire or alliance, to innovation or tradition, to the democracy that trusted in popular wisdom or the aristocracy that valued inherited excellence? The stage was set for a conflict that would test both systems to their breaking points, determining which model of civilization would survive to shape the ancient world's destiny. War came to the Greek world not with the clash of bronze on bronze, but with the breaking of an oath sworn before the gods. In the spring of 431, when the grain was beginning to ripen in Attic fields, 300 Theban hoplites slipped through the gates of Plataea like thieves in darkness. Their mission was bloodless conquest, to seize the small city that guarded the mountain passes between Attica and Boeotia, delivering it to the Spartan alliance before Athens could respond. But the Plataeans, though few in number, possessed the desperate courage of men defending their only home. As dawn broke over the mountains, they fell upon the Theban garrison with kitchen knives and farming tools, their fury making up for their lack of proper weapons. Street fighting raged until sunset, when the surviving Thebans surrendered on promise of safe conduct. That promise was broken before their bodies cooled. 300 corpses, testament to how quickly honor yielded to expedience when hostilities took hold. King Archidamus of Sparta received word of the massacre while sacrificing to the gods on the frontier of Attica. The old king had hoped that a show of strength might bring the northern democracy to terms without bloodshed, that wisdom might yet prevail over the pride driving both sides toward destruction. But the Plataean slaughter had made negotiation impossible. Theban blood cried out for vengeance, while Athenian defiance proclaimed that no threat could bend their will. The Laconian army that crossed into Attica numbered over 60,000 men, the largest host ever assembled under southern banners. Hoplites from every city of the Peloponnesian League marched in their bronze panoply, their shields blazing in the summer sun like fallen stars scattered across the earth. Behind them came the helots who would dig the siege works and carry the supplies, their presence a reminder that this conflict involved not just free citizens, but entire populations bound to their master's fate. Pericles watched the invasion from the walls of Athens, his face carved from marble as enemy campfires twinkled across the plain where his fellow citizens' farms lay abandoned. The strategy he had convinced the ecclesia to adopt was as ruthless as it was logical. Let the southerners ravage the countryside, while the naval empire provided food and wealth enough to outlast any siege. Behind the long walls that connected city to harbor, the democracy would prove that sea power trumped land power in the new age of warfare. But strategy, conceived in cool deliberation, felt different when experienced in summer heat, with 60,000 enemies camping within sight of the Acropolis. Refugees from the countryside crowded every available space within the walls, their livestock penned in sacred groves, their household goods stacked in temple courtyards. The stench of too many bodies in too small a space, mixed with smoke from enemy fires to create an atmosphere thick with misery and barely suppressed rage. Young men pressed against the gates like water against a dam, their voices rising in demands that they be allowed to march out and drive the invaders from Attic soil. Are we mice to cower in holes while our enemies feast in our fields? Shouted Cleon, the tanner, his words echoing the frustration that burned in every citizen's heart. But Pericles held firm to his design. knowing that a single defeat in open battle could undo everything that generations had built. The Southerners, for their part, found conquest more elusive than they had anticipated. Attica's farms could be burned and her olive groves cut down, but the city herself remained untouchable, behind walls that stretched from the Acropolis to the sea. Each morning, triremes sailed out to raid Peloponnesian coasts, striking at allied cities with the swiftness of hawks diving on prey. What had seemed like certain victory began to feel like an exercise in futility as weeks passed without decisive result. Archidamus withdrew his troops as autumn approached, the campaign season ending without the dramatic resolution both sides had expected. But the pattern was set. Each summer would bring invasions of Attica, while the northern fleet carried hostilities to every corner of the Peloponnese. The conflict that leaders had thought might last a single season stretched into years as both sides discovered that their opponent's strength lay precisely where their own was weakest. In the second year, catastrophe struck the democracy from an unexpected quarter. Plague, that most democratic of killers, arrived with a merchant ship from Egypt, its invisible arrows more deadly than any Spartan spear. The disease spread through the crowded city like fire through dry timber, striking down rich and poor alike, while doctors fled in terror from symptoms they could neither understand nor treat. Bodies piled up in the streets faster than they could be burned, while the living abandoned all pretense of piety or law, in their desperation to snatch whatever pleasure remained before death claimed them too. Thucydides, who survived the pestilence himself, would later write that it killed not just men, but the very foundations of civilized society, reducing the great city to a charnel house where might made right, and the gods seemed to have abandoned their worshippers entirely. Pericles himself fell victim to the disease in the third year, his death marking the end of an era when giants had shaped the destiny of nations. With him died the patient approach that had kept the northern democracy from hazarding everything on a single throw of the dice. Younger men, their blood heated by years of frustration, clamored for bolder strokes that would bring the struggle to a decisive conclusion. Cleon emerged as the voice of this new generation, his leather worker's hands gesturing dramatically as he addressed the popular gathering from the speaker's platform. Pericles counseled patience, he declared, his voice carrying across the agora like the crack of a whip. But patience profits only those who lack the strength to seize triumph. We have the finest navy in the world. Why do we not use it to strangle our enemies, rather than merely irritate them? The ecclesia that had once listened reverently to Pericles' measured wisdom now thrilled to Cleon's promises of quick triumph. When the Mytileneans rebelled against imperial rule, seeing opportunity in the empire's distress, the popular mood demanded vengeance that would serve as an example to other potential rebels. The debate that followed would be remembered as long as men studied the dangers of democracy unchecked by wisdom. Mercy is a luxury for the strong, Cleon argued, when some voices counseled moderation. These rebels knew the price of failure when they chose treachery over loyalty. Let every city in our empire see what comes of defying the northern democracy. The men executed, the women and children sold into slavery, their land given to our own colonists. But Diodotus rose to oppose this council of blood, his words cutting through the crowd's fury like a blade through silk. Justice demands punishment, he acknowledged, but wisdom demands that punishments serve our interests rather than merely satisfy our anger. Dead rebels pay no tribute, while cities driven to desperation fight with the courage of men who have nothing left to lose. The vote was closer than anyone had expected. By a handful of bronze tokens, mercy triumphed over vengeance. A second trireme raced across the Aegean to countermand the first vessel's orders, arriving just hours before the massacre was scheduled to begin. Mytilene's population was spared, though her ringleaders paid with their lives, and her walls were torn down as a reminder of imperial displeasure. Yet even as the northern democracy debated mercy for rebels, her generals were achieving triumphs that seemed to vindicate Cleon's aggressive approach. At Pylos, where Demosthenes had fortified a rocky promontory on the Messenian coast, a detachment of Laconian hoplites found themselves trapped on the island of Sphacteria by naval power. For the first time in memory, Spartans faced the choice between death and surrender, a dilemma that struck at the very heart of their military mystique. The siege dragged on through the summer as both sides recognized the immense stakes involved. If the trapped soldiers died fighting, they would join the immortal company of heroes who had perished at Thermopylae. But if they surrendered, the legend of southern invincibility would crumble like bronze in acid, demonstrating to the world that even the sons of Lycurgus were mortal men who valued life above honor when the choice was forced upon them. Cleon himself sailed to Pylos to oversee the operation, boasting in the popular gathering that he would return within 20 days with either captives or corpses. The promise seemed like madness to his critics, but the tanner-turned-general understood something about conflict that professional soldiers often missed, that boldness sometimes succeeded where caution failed, that the enemy's expectations could become weapons in a clever commander's hands. Fire and arrows drove the southerners from their makeshift fortifications, while Messenian troops who remembered their ancestors' enslavement showed no mercy to the men who had kept their people in bondage for centuries. When the survivors finally laid down their spears, 120 Spartan hoplites chose slavery over death, a choice that sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world. Laconian attempts to negotiate their soldiers' release revealed just how deeply the capture had shaken the kingdom's confidence. Envoys arrived with offers that would have ended the struggle on terms favorable to both sides: return of captured territory, recognition of spheres of influence, perhaps even formal alliance against common enemies. But the popular vote, drunk on triumph and convinced that total victory lay within their grasp, rejected every overture with scorn. "They come to us as supplicants," Cleon proclaimed, "these men who claim to be our betters. Let them taste the humiliation they sought to impose on us. When they are ready to surrender unconditionally, we will listen to their pleas." Such arrogance carried the seeds of nemesis, as wise men had always understood. The conflict that might have ended with honor for both sides instead continued with redoubled fury, each triumph breeding greater ambitions, each setback demanding more desperate remedies. The northern democracy had achieved naval supremacy and proven that even Spartans could be defeated. But the lesson she drew from these successes was that victory could be complete if only she struck hard enough. The Sicilian expedition that followed represented the ultimate expression of this imperial hubris. Alcibiades, most brilliant and most dangerous of Pericles' pupils, painted visions of conquest that dazzled the ecclesia like sunlight flashing off polished bronze. "Sicily lies heavy with grain and gold," he declared, his beauty and eloquence combining to weave spells that reason could not break. Her cities quarrel among themselves like children squabbling over toys. One stroke of northern steel could make us masters of the western Mediterranean. Nicias, old enough to remember when wisdom guided policy, spoke against the expedition with the passion of a prophet, warning of divine wrath. "We have enemies enough at our gates," he argued, his scarred hands trembling with emotion. "Why should we seek new foes across the sea when the old ones still threaten our very existence?" But the popular vote had moved beyond such cautious calculations into realms where ambition recognized no limits. 200 ships assembled in Piraeus harbor, their bronze rams gleaming like the teeth of sea monsters, their crews confident that naval mastery could overcome any obstacle. The flower of the city's youth embarked for Sicily, believing they sailed toward glory and riches beyond imagining. Instead, they found disaster more complete than anyone had thought possible. Syracusan resistance, stiffened by Laconian advisors and Corinthian naval expertise, proved far more formidable than intelligence reports had suggested. The siege that was meant to last weeks stretched into months, then years, as the expeditionary force found itself trapped in a hostile land with escape routes blocked by enemy action. Nicias, commanding an army he had never wanted to lead in an expedition he had opposed from the beginning, sent desperate messages back describing the deteriorating situation. "We are no longer besiegers, but besieged," he wrote, his words carrying across the waves like cries from the dead. "Send reinforcements or recall us, but do not leave us here to perish for want of support." The Ecclesia's response revealed how completely the democracy had lost touch with strategic reality. Rather than cutting their losses and withdrawing the trapped troops, they voted to send more ships, more men, more treasure to Sicily, doubling down on failure like gamblers who could not admit their luck had turned. Demosthenes sailed west with additional reinforcements. His reputation earned at Pylos now staked on a rescue mission that defied every principle of sound military practice. When the end came, it arrived with stunning swiftness. The northern fleet, attempting to break out of Syracuse's great harbor, was destroyed in full view of the army it was meant to save. Ships rammed each other in their desperation to escape, while bronze-beaked triremes that had once ruled the Aegean were reduced to drifting hulks manned by corpses and dying men. The retreat that followed became an odyssey of suffering that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. 40,000 began the march inland, seeking escape routes through mountain passes controlled by hostile tribes. Fewer than a tenth reached safety. The remainder scattered across Sicily as slaves or left their bones to bleach under alien skies. Nicias and Demosthenes, the generals who had led this host to destruction, met their deaths with whatever dignity remained to them. Captured while trying to rally their broken troops, they were executed despite Syracusan promises of quarter. A final betrayal in a campaign defined by miscalculation and misfortune. News of the catastrophe reached the northern democracy like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The empire that had seemed invincible just months before suddenly faced the prospect of total defeat. Her dominions crumbling as subject cities sensed weakness and rebelled against their imperial masters. Sparta, meanwhile, found new hope in Athenian misfortune and new allies willing to support a struggle that now seemed winnable. The conflict that had begun with such confidence on both sides had become a struggle for survival in which neither could afford mercy for the other. What remained was to determine whether democratic resilience or oligarchic persistence would prove stronger in the trials that lay ahead, whether freedom or discipline would emerge from the ruins of the greatest struggle the world had ever seen. The Sicilian disaster had broken Athens like a hammer striking glass, her imperial fleet lying at the bottom of Syracuse's harbor, while her finest men rotted in Sicilian quarries. Yet the democracy that had seemed doomed to extinction proved more resilient than her enemies had dared hope or fear. From the ruins of her naval supremacy, she began the slow work of rebuilding, melting down temple treasures to fund new ships, while calling upon allies who still remembered the bonds forged in resistance to Persian tyranny. But this phoenix-like resurrection came at a price that transformed the very nature of Athenian society. The moderate democracy that Pericles had guided gave way to something harsher, more desperate, willing to embrace any expedient that promised survival. When oligarchs attempted a coup in 411, seizing control of the government and opening negotiations with Sparta, the democracy's response was swift and brutal. Exile for the conspirators, confiscation of their property, and a reign of terror that reminded all citizens what happened to those who betrayed the popular will. Sparta watched these convulsions with growing confidence, sensing that her moment of final triumph was at hand. But victory in the great conflict required resources that the Laconian kingdom had never possessed: ships to challenge Athenian naval power, gold to fund extended campaigns beyond the Peloponnese. The solution came from an unexpected source, as Persian satraps offered subsidies to any Greek power willing to restore their authority over the Ionian cities that had been lost decades earlier. Lysander emerged as the architect of this new strategy, a Spartan admiral whose willingness to embrace foreign gold and foreign methods shocked traditionalists who remembered the austere values of their ancestors. Where previous commanders had relied upon Laconian discipline and spear points, Lysander understood that modern warfare required different tools: diplomatic cunning, naval expertise, and above all, the flexibility to adapt ancient principles to contemporary necessities. Under his guidance, Spartan fleets began to challenge Athenian supremacy in waters where no southern warship had ventured for generations. Persian gold hired Phoenician shipwrights to build vessels that could match the famous triremes, while promises of liberation brought city after city over to the Peloponnesian cause. The empire that had once seemed impregnable began to crumble as its foundations, tribute, naval dominance, and imperial prestige, eroded beneath sustained assault. The end came at Aegospotami, where the last great Athenian fleet met destruction through overconfidence and poor leadership. Lysander had waited patiently for days, watching his enemies beach their ships each evening, while their crews scattered to forage for supplies. When the attack finally came, it struck with the precision of a surgeon's knife. 180 triremes captured or destroyed while their crews were still stumbling toward the water's edge. Conon, the sole Athenian admiral to escape the catastrophe, sailed directly to Athens with news that struck the city like a physical blow. The fleet that had been democracy's shield and spear was gone, her empire defenseless against enemies who had learned patience from decades of defeat. As word spread through the agora, citizens wept openly for sons and brothers who would never return, while women tore their hair and beat their breasts in grief that knew no consolation. The siege that followed was brief but decisive. Spartan armies invested the city by land, while Peloponnesian ships blocked her harbors, cutting off the grain supplies that had sustained the democracy through previous ordeals. Within months, famine stalked the streets where philosophers had once debated the nature of justice, while children with swollen bellies begged for scraps outside houses, where imperial wealth had once flowed like water. In 404, Athens surrendered unconditionally, her long walls torn down by men who sang hymns of liberation as they wielded the hammers. The democracy that had challenged the might of Persia and ruled an empire stretching from the Black Sea to Sicily was reduced to a single city, her imperial ambitions buried beneath the rubble of her fortifications. But Sparta's triumph carried within itself the seeds of future troubles, as wise men had always predicted. The kingdom that had spent centuries perfecting the arts of land warfare now found itself master of a maritime empire it neither understood nor truly desired. Islands that had once paid tribute to Athens now looked to Laconian magistrates for governance, while commercial disputes that required diplomatic finesse fell to men trained only in the harsh simplicities of military command. Lysander's solution was as radical as it was effective: the installation of oligarchic governments in every former Athenian possession, ruling committees of 10 men backed by Spartan garrisons and responsible directly to the victorious power. These Dikashes, as they were called, brought order to chaos and loyalty to rebellion, but at a cost that would ultimately prove ruinous to Spartan reputation throughout the Greek world. Nowhere was this policy more harshly implemented than in Athens herself, where the 30 tyrants ruled with a brutality that made previous oligarchic experiments seem gentle by comparison. Critias, their leader, had learned his political philosophy from Socrates, but applied those lessons with a cruelty that would have horrified his teacher. Under his guidance, the new regime embarked upon a systematic purge of democratic supporters, their property confiscated to fund the oligarchy, while their blood watered the soil of Attica. The terror that followed consumed not only political opponents, but anyone whose wealth made them attractive targets for state-sponsored robbery. Citizens who had never shown interest in politics found themselves facing execution for crimes no more serious than owning productive farms or successful businesses. Within months, the oligarchy had killed more Athenians than the Peloponnesian War itself, while thousands more fled into exile rather than await their turn upon the scaffold. This rain of blood poisoned Sparta's relations with allies who had supported her cause, in expectation of liberation rather than tyranny. Cities that had welcomed Laconian victory began to wonder whether Persian rule might have been preferable to the harsh oligarchies imposed by their supposed liberators. The moral authority that had sustained Spartan leadership for generations crumbled as quickly as Athenian walls, victim of policies that prioritized control over justice. Thrasybulus, one of the democratic exiles, gathered a small force of refugees and malcontents who had suffered under oligarchic rule. From their base at Phyle, a fortress commanding the passes between Attica and Boeotia, these men began a guerrilla campaign that gradually expanded into open rebellion. Their success demonstrated how thoroughly the 30 had alienated the Athenian population, turning a city that had surrendered in exhaustion into a powder keg awaiting only a spark to explode. The oligarchy's collapse came with stunning swiftness once popular resistance gained momentum. Critias himself fell fighting against men he had once condemned to death, his blood mingling with that of his victims in the harbour district where the final battle was fought. The democratic restoration that followed was remarkably moderate, considering the injuries that had been inflicted: amnesty for political crimes, restoration of confiscated property where possible, and a return to the constitutional forms that had governed Athens before the disaster. Yet even this measured triumph carried implications that Sparta found deeply troubling. The kingdom that had fought for decades to destroy Athenian democracy now faced the prospect of its resurrection, backed by popular enthusiasm that made the previous regime seem pale by comparison. Worse still, the success of democratic restoration in Athens encouraged similar movements throughout the Greek world, challenging the oligarchic systems that Spartan policy had sought to establish. Thebes emerged as the most dangerous focus of anti-Spartan sentiment, her leaders calculating that the balance of power had shifted sufficiently to permit open defiance of Laconian hegemony. The Boeotian Confederation, that had once cowered before Spartan spears, now fielded armies that matched their enemies in discipline while surpassing them in tactical innovation. Under Epaminondas, the greatest military genius of his generation, Theban forces began to experiment with new formations that would revolutionize Greek warfare. The Sacred Band of Thebes, 150 pairs of lovers sworn to die rather than retreat. became the spear point of this military revolution. These men, bound by ties stronger than mere patriotism, fought with a ferocity that even Spartans respected, their bronze-tipped phalanx driving through enemy lines like a wedge-splitting wood. When they met Laconian hoplites in battle, the outcome was no longer predetermined by reputation and tradition. At Leuctra in 371, this new model army achieved what no Greek force had accomplished for centuries: the complete destruction of a Spartan army in open battle. King Cleombrotus lay dead among 400 of his citizens, their bodies testament to courage that had not sufficed against superior tactics and overwhelming determination. The myth of Laconian invincibility, carefully cultivated since the days of Lycurgus, died with them on that blood-soaked field. The psychological impact of defeat went far beyond mere military casualties. Sparta's entire social system rested upon the assumption that citizen warriors, properly trained and disciplined, could overcome any numerical disadvantage through superior courage and skill. When that assumption proved false, the foundations of the kingdom itself began to tremble, like walls struck by earthquake. Epaminondas followed up his victory with invasions of the Peloponnese that carried Theban spears to the very gates of Sparta herself. For the first time since the Persian Wars, enemy armies trampled through Laconia, while the city's defenders huddled behind hastily constructed fortifications. The Helots, who had labored for centuries under the lash, saw their opportunity for revenge and rose in rebellion, while Messenian exiles returned to reclaim the lands their grandfathers had lost. The liberation of Messenia struck at the economic heart of Spartan power more effectively than any military defeat. The kingdom that had thrived upon Helot labor suddenly found itself reduced to its original territory in the Eurotas Valley, while the agricultural wealth that had sustained its warrior class for centuries passed into the hands of former slaves drunk on the wine of freedom. Sparta survived these catastrophes, but only as a shadow of her former self. The citizen population that had once numbered 8,000 fighting men dwindled to fewer than 1,000, their ranks depleted by constant warfare and the rigid social system that prevented any expansion of the privileged class. Those who remained clung to ancient customs with the desperation of men trying to hold back the tide, their isolation from the wider Greek world growing more complete with each passing year. The hollow victory over Athens had cost Sparta more than defeat might have done, revealing the contradictions inherent in a system designed for one purpose: military excellence, being forced to serve ends for which it was fundamentally unsuited. The kingdom that had once terrified the world with its disciplined perfection became a relic of an earlier age, maintained more by nostalgia than power, feared more for what it had been than what it remained. As the 4th century dawned, both great cities that had shaped the course of Greek history found themselves diminished, their rivalry having consumed the strength that might have preserved their independence against the barbarian powers gathering beyond Hellas's borders. The stage was set for new players to enter the drama. Men who had learned from Athenian innovation and Spartan discipline, while avoiding the weaknesses that had brought both systems to ruin. The sun set crimson over Mantinea as Epaminondas breathed his last, the spear point that had pierced his chest taking with it the last hope of Theban supremacy. Around him lay the flower of Boeotian youth, their blood darkening the soil where they had sought to complete the revolution that Leuctra had begun. With their general's death in 362, the brief moment when Thebes had threatened to unite Greece under her hegemony flickered out like a candle in the wind. Athens and Sparta, those ancient rivals whose struggle had convulsed the Greek world for 3 decades, found themselves spectators to this final act of the drama they had begun. Both cities had contributed troops to the coalition that faced the Thebans at Mantinea. their former enmity temporarily set aside in the face of a common threat. Yet even fighting side by side, they remained shadows of their former selves, their alliance born of weakness rather than strength. The democracy that had once ruled an empire stretching from the Black Sea to Sicily now governed little more than Attica itself. Her attempts to recreate the Delian League through the Second Athenian Confederacy had met with limited success, as Greek cities remembered too well the transformation of the First Alliance into an instrument of imperial oppression. Members joined reluctantly and departed at the first opportunity, leaving Athens with the forms of hegemony but little of its substance. The naval supremacy that had been the foundation of Athenian power proved impossible to restore on its former scale. The silver mines of Laurium, though still productive, could not fund a fleet large enough to dominate the Aegean, when every major power now possessed substantial naval forces. Persian gold, Syracusan expertise, and Corinthian shipbuilding had democratized naval warfare, making the sea a contested space rather than an Athenian lake. Yet for all her political decline, Athens experienced a cultural flowering that would outlive all the empires of antiquity. In the academy that Plato founded, young men gathered to debate questions that would occupy human minds for millennia. The nature of justice, the ideal form of government, the relationship between knowledge and virtue. His pupil Aristotle, tutor to a young Macedonian prince named Alexander, systematized human knowledge in ways that would guide inquiry for the next 2,000 years. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides continued to draw audiences who found in ancient myths reflections of their own troubled times. When actors delivered the lines of Antigone or Medea, they spoke to citizens who had witnessed the collapse of certainties that had once seemed eternal as the stars. Art flourished precisely because political power had faded, freed from the obligation to serve imperial purposes. Sparta's twilight was more dramatic in its starkness, though no less complete in its finality. The kingdom that had once terrified the world with its disciplined perfection became a curiosity, maintained by nostalgia and the reluctance of other powers to complete its destruction. Visitors came to observe the agorge still functioning, the mess halls still gathering their dwindling membership, the ancient customs preserved like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. The citizen population that had numbered 8,000 warriors at the height of Spartan power shrank to barely 1,000 fighting men by the middle of the 4th century. Constant warfare, the earthquake of 464 that had killed thousands, and the rigid social system that prevented recruitment from outside the narrow circle of privilege had combined to create a demographic disaster from which recovery proved impossible. Those Spartans who remained clung to their ancient ways, with the desperation of men trying to hold back the tide. The laws of Lycurgus, designed for a citizen body large enough to maintain constant military readiness, became increasingly dysfunctional when applied to a population too small to fulfill their basic obligations. Helot uprisings, once suppressed with ruthless efficiency, now threatened to overwhelm defenders who lacked the numbers to maintain effective control. The liberation of Messenia had struck the deepest blow, depriving Sparta of the agricultural surplus that had sustained her warrior class for centuries. The Helots who had worked those rich fields now tilled them as free men, their former masters reduced to dependence upon whatever tribute allies still felt obliged to provide. The economic foundations of the Spartan system crumbled as thoroughly as its military reputation. King Agesilaus, last of the great Spartan commanders, spent his final years as a mercenary in Egypt, hiring out his tactical skills to Pharaoh Nectanebo in exchange for gold that might restore his homeland's fortunes. The irony was not lost on thoughtful observers. the heir of Leonidas reduced to fighting for barbarian pay. The kingdom that had once spurned commerce, now dependent upon it for survival. Yet Sparta's decline, like Athens's transformation, revealed truths about human nature that transcended mere political failure. The system that Lycurgus had created to produce perfect warriors had indeed achieved its goal, but perfection in one sphere had required the sacrifice of adaptability in all others. When circumstances changed, when naval warfare became crucial, when diplomacy grew complex, when economic flexibility proved essential, the very qualities that had made Spartans supreme on land became liabilities in the broader arena of interstate competition. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta had exhausted both cities, but it had also revealed the potential and limitations of their respective approaches to human organization. Democracy had proven capable of extraordinary achievements when guided by wise leadership and sustained by imperial wealth. But it had also demonstrated alarming susceptibility to demagogues and dangerous susceptibility to the intoxication of power. The assembly that had built the Parthenon and produced Pericles had also voted for the Sicilian expedition and condemned Socrates to death. Aristocracy, as embodied in the Spartan system, had shown that disciplined unity could achieve military miracles and create social stability that endured for centuries. But it had also revealed the brittleness that came from inflexibility, the inability to adapt when external conditions demanded innovation rather than tradition. The citizens who had held Thermopylae and conquered Athens had also failed to understand that victory required more than courage, that empire demanded skills their ancestors had never needed to develop. The broader Greek world, meanwhile, faced challenges that neither democracy nor oligarchy seemed capable of addressing. Philip II of Macedon watched the southern cities exhaust themselves in fruitless conflicts, while he built a military machine that combined Theban tactical innovations with resources neither Athens nor Sparta could match. The kingdom that Greeks had dismissed as semi-barbarian was learning from their mistakes while avoiding their weaknesses. At Cheronea in 338, Philip's phalanx shattered the last coalition that sought to preserve Greek independence. Athenian hoplites and Theban's sacred band falling together on a field that marked the end of the classical age. Demosthenes, greatest of Athenian orators, had warned his fellow citizens that their freedom was at stake, but his eloquence could not compensate for the military weakness that decades of internal conflict had produced. The democracy that had once ruled the seas found itself reduced to the status of an honored but powerless ally in Philip's expanding confederation. Sparta, meanwhile, remained aloof from the new order, her isolation complete, her relevance vanished. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and carried Greek culture to the Indus, neither of the cities that had shaped that culture played any significant role in the greatest adventure in human history. Yet the ideas and institutions that Athens and Sparta had pioneered outlived their political power. Democracy, refined and systematized by Athenian practice, would inspire political movements for the next 2 millennia, while the concept of citizen soldiers united by discipline and shared sacrifice would influence military thinking from Rome to the modern era. The questions they had raised about the relationship between individual freedom and collective security, about the price of empire and the value of independence, remained relevant as long as humans organized themselves into political communities. The philosophers who had flourished in Athens's intellectual climate continued their work under Macedonian patronage, their inquiries into ethics and politics eventually shaping the legal and moral foundations of Western civilization. The historians who had recorded the great conflict, Thucydides above all, created models for understanding human behavior that would guide scholars for centuries to come. In the end, the struggle between Athens and Sparta had revealed both the potential and the limitations of human political organization. Neither democracy nor aristocracy, neither innovation nor tradition, neither individual freedom nor collective discipline provided perfect solutions to the eternal problems of governance. The genius of the Greek achievementer lay not in discovering final answers, but in asking the right questions, in creating systems that revealed both the nobility and the folly of human ambition. As twilight settled over the classical world, the two cities that had defined its greatest age stood diminished but not forgotten. Their ruins would inspire future generations of builders. Their histories would teach future generations of leaders. Their example would remind future generations that even the mightiest powers were subject to the same forces of rise and decline that governed all human enterprises. The lesson they left behind was both sobering and inspiring, that human achievement, however great, remained fragile and temporary, but that the ideas and values that drove such achievement could transcend the civilizations that gave them birth. Athens and Sparta had fallen, but the questions they had explored and the standards they had set would continue to challenge and inspire as long as humans dreamed of creating societies worthy of their highest aspirations.